The muffled sound of music reverberated off the walls of the house next door, and my heart raced as I walked through the side gate, sneaking into my neighbor's party. The lights flashed in neon hues, dancing over animated faces that laughed and toasted. It was a scene of lightness and carefreeness, a stark contrast to the silent storm that was approaching. At first, I was just curious. A party that hadn't been mentioned by anyone, an invitation that hadn't crossed my desk. Something seemed strange, but I ignored it, thinking it was just another night. I walked among the people, looking for a familiar face, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary until that moment. And then I saw them. The scene seemed straight out of a nightmare. In the far corner of the room, illuminated only by the dim light of a forgotten lamp, was my wife. And him. The way their gazes met, the way their hands subtly touched, and her laugh, a laugh that wasn't meant for me. My world stopped. The surrounding noise became muffled, as if everything was submerged. She tilted her head at him, and the two of them laughed together, so close that their lips almost touched. A whisper escaped her, followed by a smile I hadn't seen for months. Every detail of that moment was etched in my mind with cruel clarity. My hands trembled and the air seemed to escape from my lungs. As someone who believed I knew everything about her, as someone who loved her more than I loved myself, I couldn't understand what I was seeing. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect?" I heard his voice, low but clear enough to hit me like a blow. "Him. Please." Her reply was accompanied by a sarcastic smile that twisted my stomach into knots. "He's too blind to notice anything." I felt a pang of hatred mixed with sadness, but above all, overwhelming humiliation. How had I gotten to this point? What had I done wrong? Why was she, the person I trusted with my life, the person I dreamed of growing old with, here, with him? But I couldn't move. My legs were stuck to the ground as if they were made of concrete. I wanted to scream, to confront them, but there wasn't enough strength in me. All I could do was watch as she handed him a piece of herself that had once been mine. They laughed as if the world was theirs, while I remained an invisible shadow, witnessing what should have been impossible. Suddenly, the lover looked away, as if sensing something. His gaze crossed mine for a split second before returning to her. He leaned over and said something in her ear. I didn't hear it, but I saw her smile disappear. Her back tensed and she slowly turned around. Our gazes met, and for a moment, the world froze. "You. What are you doing here?" she stammered, but her guilty look said it all. "That's the question I should be asking." My voice was cold, almost unrecognizable to me. Her lover tried to interject, but I held up my hand, stopping him. "Don't you dare." "Let me explain," she began, but I didn't want explanations. There weren't enough words in the world to fix what I had just seen. I left before they could follow me. The pain and anger burned in my chest like fire. But above all, there was an emptiness. An abyss that was growing and threatening to swallow me up. That night marked the end of something I thought was eternal. But what I didn't know at the time was that it wasn't just the beginning of my mourning. It was also the beginning of a chain of events that would turn our lives upside down. Her lover, the man in whom she had placed her blind trust, had secrets. Secrets that would change not only her fate, but mine too. And in the midst of it all, I would discover that there are betrayals that transcend marriage, betrayals that strike at the soul and leave scars that never heal. What she didn't know, and perhaps never imagined, was that this man had a history that would put her in a much more vulnerable position than she could ever have predicted. What he did, and how it would connect to me, was something no one could have anticipated. As I walked away from that house, one thought dominated my mind: it doesn't end here. Welcome to the channel. Here, we believe that betrayal is never justified, and we show, through fictional stories, how it can destroy lives, relationships and dreams. Each narrative is a powerful warning about the devastating consequences of wrong choices. Get ready for an intense and shocking story that will hold your attention from start to finish. So settle in and enjoy the story. The red brick house was the perfect reflection of the life built by Ethan and Clara. Simple but welcoming, it exuded the essence of a home cultivated with care and dedication. For Ethan, that space was the safe haven where he found balance after long days working for a logistics company. Clara, for her part, had transformed the interior of the house into a space that felt like an embrace, full of details that showed off her good taste, handmade cushions, light curtains that let the morning light in gently, and the constant aroma of fresh coffee that seemed to be part of the very fabric of the house. Their marriage had turned 10 last month. Clara had prepared a special dinner to mark the occasion, a quiet evening that contrasted with the usual rush of their routines. Ethan could still remember her smile as she tucked her hair behind her ear, something she did whenever she was anxious. He had held her hand across the table and promised, once again, to be the man she deserved. Clara laughed, as she did every time he tried to be romantic, but behind the smile there was something he couldn't decipher. A shadow, perhaps. The days went on predictably, almost mechanically, but Ethan believed that this was normal after so many years together. He justified the lack of spontaneity to himself with the exhausting routine and the weight of responsibilities. Clara had given up her career as a photographer to devote herself entirely to the house. The decision had been made jointly, but as time went by, Ethan realized that Clara didn't seem as happy as she used to be. Still, she never complained, she just got lost on long walks around the neighborhood or on whole afternoons spent reading in the garden. The neighborhood where they lived was quiet, a residential area where neighbors knew each other by name and children played in the street until sunset. The house next door had recently been sold, and the new owner, a man called Martin, soon became the talk of the town. Young, charming and always in a good mood, Martin was the opposite of Ethan, who had a more reserved personality. Clara seemed intrigued by the new neighbor, but Ethan saw it as natural. He himself found Martin friendly and even began to exchange a few words with him from time to time. Martin, however, seemed to have an unusual facility for connecting with people. He organized small gatherings at his house, inviting the neighbors to impromptu parties. Ethan, who preferred quiet evenings watching movies with Clara, always declined the invitations, but Clara insisted that it was good to get to know the new neighbor better. "He seems so nice. You should give him a chance," she said, with a twinkle in her eye that Ethan hadn't seen for ages. But he just smiled and said he wasn't a big fan of crowds. Although Ethan trusted Clara, he couldn't ignore the distance that seemed to grow between them. It wasn't arguments or fights, but a silent disconnection, as if they were going in opposite directions in the same house. He tried to compensate with simple gestures, buying flowers on the way home or leaving notes on the fridge with affectionate messages. Clara smiled, but seemed distracted, as if her mind was elsewhere. On the other hand, Clara felt suffocated by the monotony. She loved Ethan, or at least believed she did, but something inside her was restless. It was an emptiness she couldn't explain, a feeling that something was missing. Her afternoons in the garden had become moments of introspection, where she questioned what she really wanted out of life. When Martin appeared in the neighborhood, bringing with him a new, relaxed energy, Clara found herself curious about this man who seemed to radiate lightness. One afternoon, while Ethan was at work, Clara met Martin at the gate, mowing the grass in his garden. He greeted her with a warm smile and made a joke about being too lazy to mow the lawn regularly. She laughed, and for the first time in a long time, she felt seen, noticed. The encounter was brief, but it left a deep impression. It wasn't something she fully understood, it was just a spark, a feeling of newness in the midst of the exhausting routine. Ethan, oblivious to these interactions, was more focused on his own challenges. Work demanded more and more of him, and he began to question whether he was devoting enough time to Clara. At night, lying next to her, he tried to start deep conversations, but the words didn't seem to reach her. There was a chasm between them, a space he didn't know how to fill. "Is everything all right?" he asked one night, as she looked out of her bedroom window. Clara took her time answering, as if weighing up her words before speaking. "Yeah, I'm just tired, I guess. He knew there was something more to it, but decided not to press her. He thought that, in time, everything would return to normal. Martin's arrival brought a series of changes to the dynamics of the neighborhood. Parties started to become more frequent, and Clara seemed increasingly interested in taking part. Ethan found it curious, but also felt a slight discomfort, although he couldn't explain why. He trusted Clara, but a voice in his mind began to whisper doubts that he tried to ignore. The days went by, and the distance between Ethan and Clara continued to grow. For Ethan, this was a call to try even harder; for Clara, it was a sign of something she couldn't name. The tranquility of the red brick house was beginning to break down, and the cracks, although small, were becoming visible. While the neighborhood bustled with Martin's events, the couple seemed increasingly isolated in their own reality. Ethan watched Clara with a look of concern, while she, in her moments of solitude, wondered if there was still a way back to what they had before. What they both didn't know was that the choices they made over the next few days would determine not only their future, but also that of everyone around them. And so the couple's story began to unfold, with every silence, every smile and every lost moment adding new layers to a plot that was about to explode. The growing noise of laughter echoed through Martin's house, while music filled every corner. The party seemed to be the busiest yet. Clara hesitated as she crossed the threshold, nervously adjusting the strap of her dress. She had insisted on going alone, arguing that Ethan needed to rest after an exhausting week at work. He reluctantly agreed. The idea of socializing with strangers didn't appeal to him, but the way Clara insisted made him uncomfortable. Just for a few hours, she had said with a smile that he found hard to refuse. But as the door closed behind her that night, a foreboding began to form in Ethan's chest. Meanwhile, the atmosphere at the party was vibrant. Martin, ever the charismatic host, circulated among the guests, greeting everyone with a familiarity that made each person feel special. Clara was among them. The lightness with which Martin made her laugh was something she hadn't experienced for a long time. She allowed herself to forget, for a moment, the worries she had at home. Ethan, for his part, couldn't sleep. Sitting on the sofa in the living room, the silence around him seemed to amplify his doubts. Something about Clara's recent enthusiasm for these parties bothered him. He wasn't a jealous man by nature, but he felt that there was a growing distance between them. A space he didn't know how to fill, but which Martin seemed to occupy with ease. Hours passed and Clara didn't return. Ethan decided not to call; he didn't want to seem controlling, but the anxiety was evident on his face. When the clock struck 1 in the morning, he gave in. He picked up his cell phone and typed a short message, "Are you okay? It's getting late." The reply came minutes later, quick and casual, "Fine. I'll be right there." But she never arrived. When the clock's hand pointed to 2, Ethan could no longer contain his restlessness. He grabbed his coat and decided to go to the party. Perhaps she had lost track of time, which is normal when you're among friends. He tried to rationalize the situation as he walked to the house next door. The sound of the music diminished as he approached, but something was wrong. The energy of the party seemed to have changed, and the few guests who were still there were moving around the garden in a scattered manner. He walked through the front door, feeling his heart racing. The room was almost empty, with only a few unfamiliar faces exchanging scattered words. Climbing the stairs with silent steps, an instinct took hold of him. He didn't know what he was looking for, but something was guiding him. Upstairs, a narrow corridor stretched out in front of him. Doors closed, voices muffled. He stopped in front of one of them and heard low laughter, followed by a whisper that sounded familiar. His hand trembled as he turned the handle. What he saw on the other side of the door made the floor seem to collapse beneath his feet. Clara was there, sitting on the bed, her hair in disarray, an expression of surprise frozen on her face. Next to her, Martin, with an awkward smile, which soon faded when he saw Ethan. The scene was clear, but the words were lacking. All he could hear was the deafening sound of his own heart beating. "Ethan, Clara began, but her voice sounded distant, like an echo. He didn't answer. There was no room for that. He just turned and left, each step seeming heavier than the last. The words stuck in his throat found no way out. The betrayal, raw and undeniable, stood before him, and he didn't have the strength to face it at that moment. The door closed behind him, but the impact of that moment would continue to echo for a long time. Ethan couldn't say how long he sat in the car parked in front of his house. The clock on the dashboard flashed, but he could barely see the numbers. All that occupied his mind was the image of Clara and Martin together. The initial shock began to give way to a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, humiliation, and something deeper, something he couldn't name. That night, the silence in the house seemed to cry out. Clara didn't return immediately, and Ethan didn't try to contact her. Instead, he let the emptiness of the room be his only companion. The betrayal was clear, but there was one question that wouldn't leave his mind: why? What had led Clara, his companion for so many years, to cross that line? He knew he needed answers, but above all, he needed time to process what had happened. The next morning, Clara walked through the door with hesitant steps. Her gaze met Ethan's for a brief moment, but then turned away. He was sitting at the table, his face serious, his expression tired. The silence between them was almost palpable. "Ethan, he held up his hand, interrupting her. "I don't want apologies, Clara. I want explanations. Sit down." She obeyed, slowly pulling out the chair. Her eyes were red, but Ethan didn't care. He wanted the truth, not tears. "How long has this been going on?" His voice was cold, almost cutting. Clara hesitated, her fingers playing nervously with the strap of her bag. "It's not like you think." "Then tell me how it is." He stared at her, as if trying to decipher her every move. "It was a moment of weakness," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to explain it. I felt alone, and he was kind to me. But it doesn't mean anything, Ethan. You have to believe me. It means nothing." He laughed, but the sound was laced with bitterness. "Do you think it makes any difference? You've destroyed what we've built together, Clara. And all for someone you barely know." Clara opened her mouth to reply, but closed it again. She seemed to be struggling with something she couldn't say. Ethan saw this and clenched his fists. "Is there anything else you're not telling me?" She hesitated, but then lowered her head, as if the internal struggle had come to an end. "Ethan, I didn't want you to find out like that." "Find out what?" His patience was wearing thin. Clara took a deep breath, and the words finally came out. "Martin isn't who you think he is." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" She looked up at him, and now there was a mixture of fear and shame in her expression. He knew about us long before he moved here. He knew me." Ethan was silent for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. "What do you mean, knew?" Clara swallowed. "I met him years ago, before we got married. It was something brief, unimportant, but he never forgot." "So you knew who he was when he moved here?" Ethan's voice was filled with incredulity. She nodded slowly. "Yes. And he came to me. He said he wanted to start again, that he wanted to recover what we'd lost." "And you believed him?" Ethan stood up, unable to sit still. "You let this man into our lives, into our home, knowing what he wanted?" "I thought I could control the situation," she said quickly, but the guilt in her voice was undeniable. "I didn't know things would get out of hand." Ethan started pacing back and forth, trying to digest the information. "So he planned it? He moved here just to destroy what we have?" Clara shook her head. "I don't know. He said he wanted a second chance. And I was weak." "Weak?" Ethan stopped and stared at her. You were selfish, Clara. You put everything at risk, our lives, our marriage, for someone who clearly doesn't care about anything but himself. Clara started to cry, but Ethan felt no compassion. Not at that moment. He knew there was more to the story, and he was determined to find out. Why now, Clara? What does he have against you? There's something you're not telling me. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on hers. She hesitated again, but finally gave in. He has something that could destroy us. Ethan narrowed his eyes. What does he have? Clara looked like she was about to fall apart. Letters. Old messages. Things I wrote to him, before we got married. Things that, you wouldn't understand. Letters. He felt his blood boil. Are you telling me he's blackmailing you? She nodded, tears streaming down her face. He said that if I didn't find him, if I didn't let him in, he'd show everything to you. To everyone. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. So you gave in. You gave in to a blackmailer. I was afraid, she whispered. I didn't want to lose you, Ethan. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You've already lost me, Clara. The moment you chose to hide it from me, the moment you chose to believe him instead of trusting me. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara had no more words, and Ethan was tired of fighting against the tide of emotions that washed over him. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but firm. It's not over, Clara. But now I need time. I need to think. He left, leaving her alone in the kitchen, with tears and guilt as her only companions. As Ethan walked down the street, his mind was racing. He knew that Martin hadn't revealed everything yet. The secret that Clara feared still hung over them, and Ethan was determined to face it, but on his own terms. Ethan walked through the streets in silence, the cold night wind cutting into his skin. Every step seemed to take him away not only from Clara, but from the very life he had built with her. The revelation of her betrayal and, worse, Martin's manipulation, had crumbled everything he had believed to be solid. His mind was in turmoil, and Clara's words echoed in his thoughts, he has something that can destroy us. He stopped in front of an empty park. The sight of a swing swaying in the wind seemed to resonate with the state of his soul. It wasn't just the betrayal that destroyed him, but the fact that he somehow felt he hadn't been enough. That thought ate away at him, even though, rationally, he knew it wasn't his fault. But how does a marriage get to this point? How can two strangers infiltrate a life that should be shielded by love? The questions remained unanswered as he sat on a bench, clasping his hands together as if trying to contain the anger growing in his chest. It was more than anger. It was a sense of injustice, of powerlessness in the face of a situation that had been orchestrated in the shadows. He knew he had to face Martin, there was no other choice. But how could he face a man who seemed to have foreseen his every move? When Ethan finally returned home, the silence was heavy. Clara was sitting in the living room, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if she was afraid to look at him. He walked in without saying a word, passed her and went straight to the bedroom. The sound of the door closing was the only noise that filled the room. Clara remained where she was, unable to move, while a silent tear ran down her cheek. The next morning, Ethan said nothing. He took his keys, left the house and drove aimlessly. The city seemed smaller, suffocating. Every corner reminded him of happy times that now seemed as distant as another life. Finally, he parked in front of a small cafe he used to go to when he needed to think. He went in, ordered a black coffee and sat down in a secluded corner. He wasn't alone for long. A man with a familiar, smug smile entered the cafe, as if he had been called by fate. Martin. Ethan felt the adrenaline rush through his veins. He wanted to confront him right there, but something stopped him. Instead, he watched as Martin placed his order and casually looked around. Their gazes met. Martin hesitated for a moment, but then smiled and walked over to Ethan's table. "What a coincidence," said Martin, placing his cup on the table and sitting down uninvited. "Or maybe not so much." Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the man in front of him, anger bubbling under the surface. "You came looking for me, didn't you?" Martin laughed softly. "Let's just say I figured you'd be here. It's a quiet place to think, isn't it?" Ethan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed. "What do you want, Martin?" "You've already gotten what you wanted. You've destroyed my marriage. You must be satisfied." "Destroyed your marriage?" Martin raised an eyebrow, an almost theatrical tone in his voice. "Ah, Ethan, that was never my intention. Clara and I have a history, something that won't be erased so easily." "History?" Ethan repeated, his voice low and heavy. "That's not history, that's obsession. You manipulated Clara, used her weakness to get into our lives." Martin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You talk as if you were a perfect victim, but tell me, Ethan, do you really think you took care of Clara as you should have? Or were you too busy, too preoccupied with your own world, to realize what she was missing?" Those words hit Ethan like a punch. He knew there were hard truths in there, but hearing them from Martin was unbearable. "That doesn't justify what you did. What you're doing." Martin smiled enigmatically. "I don't need to justify anything. Clara made her choices. And frankly, Ethan, you have no idea what's really at stake here." "Then tell me," Ethan challenged, leaning forward. "Tell me what's at stake." Martin leaned back in his chair, apparently enjoying the tension. "Clara mentioned the letters, right? But that's just the surface. What I have goes far beyond a few silly words of old love." Ethan felt his stomach turn. "What do you mean, goes beyond?" Martin took a sip of coffee before continuing. "Clara and I share more than memories. There are things that, if they came to light, could change not only what you think about her, but also about yourself." Ethan didn't know how to react. Martin's insinuation was vague, but loaded with meaning. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "You're a pathetic manipulator, Martin. But you won't get anything out of me. I'll find out what you're hiding, and I'll put an end to it." Martin laughed again, a low, almost cruel sound. "Good luck, Ethan. I really hope you're prepared for what you're going to find." With that, he stood up, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and a cup of cold coffee. The weight of Martin's words was unbearable. Ethan knew there was more to the story, something he couldn't yet see, but which loomed like a shadow. He had no choice. He had to go back to Clara and demand the whole truth. When he returned home, Clara was sitting in the kitchen, her face pale and her eyes swollen. She looked at him, but said nothing. Ethan put his keys on the table and crossed his arms. "I found Martin," he said, his voice firm. Clara took a deep breath, as if preparing for a blow. "And, what did he say?" "He said that you and he have more secrets," Ethan replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "And that those secrets could change everything." "I want to know what he meant, Clara. Now." She hesitated, her hands trembling. "Ethan, I don't know how to say this. It's something I should have told you a long time ago, but I was afraid." Ethan didn't look away. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that I'd finally see who you really are." The words hit him, but he accepted them. "Afraid of losing you," she said softly, the tears starting to flow. "But I know I can't run away from it anymore." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Ethan waited, his heart pounding. He knew that what Clara was about to reveal would change everything, but he was ready to listen. Or at least he needed to believe he was. Clara finally took a deep breath, like someone about to dive into deep, unknown waters. "Martin and it wasn't just a mistake from the past, Ethan. It was a choice I made before I met you. Something I thought I'd never have to face again." Ethan crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on her. What choice, Clara? What are you hiding? She hesitated for a moment before continuing, her voice breaking. Before we got married, Martin and I had a complicated relationship. He was intense, possessive. When I broke up with him, I thought it would be the end. But what I didn't know was that he would keep something that would haunt me forever. Ethan remained silent, but the tension in his posture was evident. Clara closed her eyes, as if the next words would be too difficult to pronounce. Martin has photos, of the two of us together. Compromising photos that he took without my consent. Ethan's expression hardened. Photos? Is that all? Clara shook her head. That's not all. He used those photos as a way of manipulating me, even before he moved here. When he showed up in our neighborhood, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. He told me he had more than the photos. He had messages, letters, things I never wanted you to see, things that could end what we have. And you gave in, Ethan said, his voice full of bitterness. You let this man into our lives and destroy everything, because you were afraid. Yes, Clara admitted, tears streaming down her face. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. But I was also afraid of what Martin might do. He threatened me, Ethan. He said he'd make you hate not just me, but all of our history. Ethan took a deep breath, fighting the mixture of anger and disbelief that consumed him. He finally stood up, running his hands over his face. What now? What does he want now? He wants, Clara swallowed. He wants me to let him back into my life. For me to break up with you. The silence that followed was piercing. Ethan looked at her, his gaze filled with a deep sadness. And you were willing to do that? I don't know, she whispered, her voice breaking. I was lost. I didn't know what to do. Ethan felt a growing anger, but also an unexpected clarity. He could no longer be part of that game. Clara's betrayal was unbearable, but the fact that she had allowed Martin to manipulate them was the last straw. You made your choice, Clara, he finally said, his voice firm. And now I'm making mine. I'm not going to live with this any longer. I'm going to face Martin, and I'm going to end it, alone. Ethan wasted no time. He drove straight to Martin's house, determined to confront the man who had destroyed his life. When Martin opened the door, he was greeted by Ethan's stare. Ah, Ethan, Martin said with a smug smile, what a surprise. Clara finally told you everything? Yes, Ethan replied coldly. And now it's your turn. Martin took a step back, but Ethan followed him. Do you want to play this game, Martin? Fine. But you're not going to win. Martin laughed. Win? Ethan, this was never about winning or losing. It was about what Clara and I have. Something you'd never understand. Understand what? Ethan said, taking another step forward. That you're a pathetic manipulator, using fear to control people. That I understand perfectly. Martin's confidence wavered for a moment, but he quickly regained his poise. Do you think you can change anything? I have everything I need to destroy you and Clara. Maybe, Ethan said, his voice low but charged with intensity. But there's something you don't have, Martin, the truth. You can manipulate, lie, threaten. But the truth is that you're an empty man, trying to fill your own failure with the chaos you cause in the lives of others. For a moment, Martin didn't know what to say. Ethan seized the opportunity and continued. You can keep your threats, your photos, your letters. Because now I know what you really are. And I'm not going to let you control my life anymore. Martin tried to speak, but Ethan was already leaving him alone with his failure. Ethan returned home, but not to Clara. He packed his things, left a short note and left. He knew that their marriage had come to an end. There was no more trust, and without that, there was no future. Clara found the note when she went down to the kitchen. The tears came immediately, but this time she knew there was nothing else to do. Ethan had made his choice, and she would have to live with the consequences of her own actions. Months passed. Ethan started a new life in another city, away from the painful memories. He found renewed purpose, dedicating himself to a job that inspired him. Eventually, he met someone who brought back a sense of hope. It wasn't easy to open up again, but he knew that the past didn't have to define the future. Clara, for her part, faced her choices. She moved away from Martin, who, without his influence on her, ended up alone, trapped in his own emptiness. Clara sought help to understand why she had allowed things to go so far. Although she knew she could never fully repair what she had done, she found a way to start again, alone. And so, each character faced their destiny. Ethan rebuilt his life, Clara faced her truths, and Martin disappeared into the oblivion he so feared. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was in their hands, a future that was now shaped by their choices. If you've made it this far, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, which show how betrayal destroys lives and relationships. Here, we never support any form of betrayal. See you next time.